Hi everyone, welcome to Hacktable's The History of Computing and Gaming workshop presented by Ben Moskalensky. So I'll let you take it from here.
Hi everyone, I'm Ben Moskalensky. So first I just want to verify Emma, and if anyone in the chat has any issues, you should just be able to see like my face, and you should be able to see the Hacktable intro slide for this. Is that all good? All right, I'll take that as a yes. So just for like a little clarification, in terms of computing, I'll be talking about like technological advancements like in general. So it won't be specific to personal computers. It'll be, computing, processing as a whole. I'll be focusing on things from both a hardware and software perspective. Definitely my expertise is in software. I'm a computer science hopeful I'm a rising senior, so you don't have to start thinking about college. So I'm a computer science hopeful. And definitely my expertise is in the software realm, but I'll try to as processors, CPUs, all that kind of stuff kind of evolve over time. I'll definitely be keeping track of that as well, but this will mostly be from like a, consumerist standpoint. We'll have Q&A and all that kind of stuff at the end. I can talk about like my personal beliefs and experience and all that sort of stuff. And for the sake of time, just because I have this structured as a timeline, we're going to be going by decades, starting from the 1960s, going until the 2010s. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. See, people outside are just really happy that I'm getting started. So first, we're going to talk about it purely from a technology. We'll kind of jump it back and forth between like general technology and more specifically gaming. But in the 1960s, right, gaming, as we'll discuss soon, kind of really grabs hold in the digital world in the 1970s with the development of Pong. It's a hyper popular arcade game. So we'll get into that pretty soon here, but generally at this point we'll just be looking at, I guess, like more generalized consumer technology or business technology. So in the year 1960, Algol is developed. It's the first procedural language, really. There was a whole lot of, I guess, manual computation going on in computers prior to this, because you had like efforts in computing going all the way back to World War II. Computing definitely doesn't start with Paul Allen and Bill Gates, excuse me. So Algol is like the first procedural language. It's kind of structured in like the general way where we're used to the languages that we use now. The procedural languages like Java. Java's object-oriented, but like BASIC or those sorts of languages. Structured in that kind of procedural, like go by method, top to bottom sort of way. Then in 1961, IBM, famous computing company, releases APL, which is it's another language. Now languages are kind of getting more complicated. You have specific types, all that kind of stuff. With APL, it's languages are, even now, right? Other than Python, many of like the mainstream languages, even if you use them in a procedural way, like Java as an example is object-oriented, but you can use the object-oriented languages in a procedural way, right? If you avoid the use of classes and objects and those kinds of things. So even like removing that, there's still sorts of all kinds of complicated syntax. Like Java as an example is a strongly typed language, meaning you have to use a whole lot of, type declarations in front of variables. So like you can't just say word equals double quote banana. You have to say string word equals banana in double quotes to indicate that's a string. So this is still a big improvement though from like the older languages. So like APL is an example. They use multi-dimensional arrays as all of their types. So you always have to be accessing arrays and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Then we kind of get into more advanced computing. In 1962, Manchester University develops Atlas. It's kind of an original supercomputer. It had much better processing power than any other computers available at this point. It was sort of like a prototype attempt at supercomputer. It's pretty slow compared to today's standards. That's weird. It's a supercomputer by the standards of the 1960s. There were a grand total of 1, 2, 3 of these sold, which just tells you how big computing was in that day, where you have this unbelievable, like, in terms of its speed and processing power, like world-class computer, and there were a grand total of 3 sold. And it's, those computers you see the photos of where it takes up entire rooms just for like a simple computer. And like in the several decades back, it's one of those types. Believe it or not, in 1963, the mouse was invented. Now, the mouse wouldn't become popularized until Steve Jobs would use it in he would use basically Xerox's model that they developed in the 70s, but people were actually coming up, they weren't popularized with computers until Apple, but mouses were actually invented long time ago, 1963. And also, little computer science fun fact, it's mice if you're talking about animals, but it's mouses if you're talking about like, one of these. You can't see one of these. I don't know why. I can't explain that, but that's what it is. Then in 1964, you have basically what are called different generations of computers based off processing power and all that kind of stuff. So you have the Generation 3 computers that get launched. They're just smaller. They can do more. It's just like a general like progression. Like, oh, CPU is getting better, processing power is getting better, RAM is getting better, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's kind of it for that. Then the IBM System 360 was launched. Basically, the deal with that is it's the first computer where for scientific uses and business world uses kind of come together, just in the sense of how it was used before. Those were two kind of like separate types of computers. You had like business computers and scientific computers. The IBM kind of meshed those two together with the 360, just like with some of its features, you were able to do that. And also the byte system was developed. I don't know if it was developed for this computer, but having, computers, how do you describe a bit? But basically, well, bits, right? They're singular pieces of data, binary pieces of data. They are stored with regards, right? But many of the modern data encapsulators, so like kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, they're not bits, they're bytes. Bytes are 8 bits. That's just like the way it was, like the organization worked out better that way. And that was developed around this time. That's standard. Then in 1965, they came up with a more efficient packet switching as a means of, transferring data. Because initially, if the way it worked before was like entire files could get lost if certain little bits of information were lost, right? Like if you have we were not talking about these kinds of data sizes that back in the day, but let's just use like a modern example. Let's say you have a 3 megabyte photo. If you try to get every single bit in that 3 megabyte photo, because we're talking about 24 million-ish bits in that one photo, if a single bit gets lost along the way, the entire thing could fall apart because it doesn't acknowledge it as proper. Storing things with packets and basically just sending data in packets is much more efficient, as there can be necessary loss that doesn't really impact the photo that much. And then you have the CDC 6600 that was developed around this time period. It was basically the first more commercially available supercomputer, because again, that Atlas wasn't very successful. What else? 1967 is a big one because you have the floppy disk being invented. You had these separate drives. They were these they were these several inch, like 8, 9 to 1 foot. They can actually be more like 1.5 feet even, squares, right? We're kind of used to now, at least in the 2000s, 1990s, since you have things stored on disks, circular disks. Floppy disks were squares. You had this separate drive. You'd put it into the computer, and you literally get, I think it was in the kilobytes. It depends. It was like 4, 8 kilobytes. You had a whole separate drive you had to connect to your computer to load data, to load information into the computer. So that was, floppy disks started around that time. 1968, famous, what's it called? Semiconductor company, Intel founded. And then from there, you have the HP 9100A release. That was a programmable and scientific calculator, the first of its kind. So now we're kind of getting into calculators, kind of using machines in the, most proper context, right? That's primarily what they do, is they compute things. They process numbers. It's at the basis level, what all of computing is the numbers, binary. So this HP 9100A is effectively the first calculator. And then finally, at the end of the decade, in 69, the DoD starts researching and putting funds into ARPANET through a proxy corporation. ARPANET would go on to become the internet, basically a series of tubes connecting computers across a very, very, very long distance. It was meant to be developed. No, sorry, not meant to be developed. This was being looked into post World War II, right? Because we're only a couple decades in the future now. In mountain bases and army mountain bases, in case of a nuclear fallout of some sort, communication between these different mountain military bases would be impossible without something like ARPANET, like the internet as we know it today. So that brings us to the end of the 1960s. There's no gaming section this time because nothing happened really at this point. 1970s are only the time when things start, but we'll look more at technology in the 1970s. So as you can see, things are kind of just kicking into gear in the 1960s. People are kind of inventing stuff, but nothing much is really happening at this point. In the 1970s, things really pick up. You have Intel releasing the 4004, which is the first commercially available. Actually, no, I think the first ever microprocessor. The 4004 has it's a 4-bit processor, 60,000 instructions per second. And for context, modern you count the actual like data, what's it called? The unit in which data is processed these days is in millions of pixels per second. Or instructions, excuse me, millions of instructions per second. This was about 60,000 instructions per second to give you context on how far we've come in just 50 years. And then you had the founding of Texas Instruments, the famous calculator company, right? Like if you look at your TI-84, that TI is for Texas Instruments. They also did like a decent amount of work in the computing realm. In 1972, Atari is founded, one of the most famous computing and gaming companies of all time, especially in the olden days. They kind of got, they sort of had like meteoric heights in the 80s before sort of getting shot down with their, once Commodore bought them out. And now Atari is, excuse me, well, that applies to Amiga actually, excuse me, not Atari. But Atari definitely lost relevance over time. They just kind of stopped developing. But this was one of the biggest companies in the day. They had one of the most iconic gaming / home consoles of all time and computers of all time, the Atari 2600. And then the procedural language C is developed, very iconic language still used to this day. Obviously, future versions of it has memory. You actually have to allocate memory. That's like one big thing in C. Then in 1973, you have Ethernet. Again, building on the idea of ARPANET, long distance connections, all that kind of stuff, more efficient, fewer packets lost, etc. Then in 75 and 76, it's crazy how this works out. You're going to see, especially in gaming, there's some really weird timing coincidences. In 75, Bill Gates and Paul Allen found Microsoft. Microsoft really does not seriously kick off until much later, like 90s, give or take. Depends who you ask. But Microsoft rose to super prominence in the 90s, really. And they weren't really much right off the bat. But then 1 year later, of all times, that's when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak get together to form Apple. Whew. And then from there, the IBM 3800 is invented. This is the first laser printer. I believe before this, they had what were called dot matrix printers. Correct me if I'm wrong. These are like much less efficient printers, just in general. Then in 1977, you have CES, which is the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. They have it there every December, or actually January. They have it there every single January. All of like the biggest tech, biggest names, everyone shows up. It's always like a fun time, a cool time to show off your, whatever new technology you have coming down the pipeline. The thing about this specific, they called about like the importance, I guess, of the 1977 CES is you had what's called the 1977 trilogy. 3 of the most famous computers, not the most famous, but 3 very famous computers all came out around the same time or were demoed at the same time, being the Apple II, the TRS-80, and the Commodore PET. They all had some like pretty nifty features. I'm not going to delve too much into that, but they all had some pretty nifty features, and they were all competing against each other because you had this now like this new rise in computing and home computing, and they're all kind of fighting against each other for it. However, Commodore PET is kind of colloquially known as the first first PC. Then in 1979, you have the CD, the compact disc. It's invented. It's just it's kind of you have floppy disk, CD. It's similar purpose, more compact. Floppy disks are pretty big and they're kind of thick as well. Maybe a floppy disk is as thick as my phone, maybe even thicker actually. CD, everyone has seen like a DVD or a CD. They're thinner. They're much thinner. You also have the invention of VisiCalc. Many people might not know what VisiCalc is. VisiCalc is actually super duper important. It's basically the Excel before Excel. It was a spreadsheet application commonly used by businesses, all kinds of different like computing entities. It's effectively the pre-Excel. So a whole lot of accounting and similar business like number allocation, organizing, all of that was sort of stored using VisiCalc before Excel and Google spreadsheet and all that stuff rose to prominence because formerly it was all done by hand, which I'm sure was not fun. And you have Atari, they're releasing their 400 and 800. It's weird. It's like the same. The 400 and 800, as far as as far as my research told me, is effectively the same computer. Just different names for it, but yeah, they had these like consoles home. It's not as important. I just want to mention that Atari is making strides at this point. They're putting themselves on the market. It's going to get much more important once we get to 2600 and ST coming before. Moving on to gaming. So now gaming is actually kind of getting a start. We had like some experimental stuff going on before this with gaming. I didn't cover it too much because nothing in gaming from a video gaming standpoint really matters before Pong. I bring up the Oregon Trail just as a frame of reference, and plus Oregon Trail I feel is pretty known. It's this text-based game where you have some graphics moving along the screen, wonderful, and then you're literally just asked, oh, whatever, here's some encounter. What do you want to do? Do you want to do this or this? Yes or no? Something like that. It's a text-based game. There's nothing to it. And this is kind of how any form of gaming before this was kind of going. Oregon Trail had a more creative plot and slightly better graphics, like slightly visually better looking than a lot of games, but you couldn't actually do anything with said movements. It was just, again, it was all text-based games. Then we have Pong in 1972. It was the first really successful arcade game, and it exploded. I'm sure anyone here who knows anything about gaming has already seen Pong in one of its many iterations. It's one of the most famous games of all time. It's effectively video game table tennis. You have like a little ball. It like bounces from one end of the screen to the other. You have like a blocker. You can go up and down. It bounces back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Kind of a fun game, actually, depending on the speed of the ball, who you're playing with, all that kind of stuff. I'd recommend it. Very basic and primitive, but this took off like wildfire. The interest in arcades at this point basically exploded and didn't really stop until home PCs for gaming and what's the other thing? And consoles, video game consoles as well, really took off. Before that was a commonality, you had arcade games. Everyone wanted to go to the arcade games to play Pong. And then a few years later, you had some very good arcade games that followed it up before they made their way into the home through things like the Atari 2600. And the Amiga 1000, especially. We'll talk about that. Maze War was the first-person shooter. It was, as you see here, this kind of maze structure. Some horror games actually emulate this now, where you're like running down rooms. You find an enemy, you press a button to shoot, you continue. Very primitive, not exactly Halo, but it's a start. This is where, keep in mind, this is the founding of all these things. It's, what is this, 45 years ago. Then we have the Atari 2600. It's a home gaming console / PC. Hyper popular. It comes with a joystick, interchangeable cartridges, color, games, buttons, all the kind of stuff like the classic you'll see like in Stranger Things. They're playing on these really hokey looking computers at their home and that stuff. You have like the hokey graphics, all that kind of stuff. In the home context, it's Atari 2600. This thing spread like wildfire. It was super duper fun. It had all kinds of gaming options from home, and it doubled as a PC. Then we have 1978's Space Invaders. I believe this is a Japanese game initially, but it certainly gained popularity throughout Europe, throughout Asia. Space Invaders really took gaming on an international level because Pong is an American game. Space Invaders was marketed globally. Again, it might have not been made in America. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it definitely had a pretty decent international market for Space Invaders. And it was this game I definitely prefer over Pong. My favorite arcade game is Asteroids, but Space Invaders is also really fun. It's definitely more complicated. Pong, you effectively just move up and down. There's a little scoreboard. Space Invaders, there's multiple levels. The aliens, they'll come down to you while you're firing up at them. You have three, so there's multiple lives. You have 3 lives. You have these barriers. They have like finite amounts of life, each of these barriers, right, as the aliens fire at them. There's bonuses. There's different factors that go into the score. It's a color game eventually. There's a lot more that's going into Space Invaders than Pong. There's many more moving parts, and it's just a 6-year time gap. And then we have the Intellivision. Mattel releases it. It's kind of similar in concept to the Atari because the 2600 was so successful, and this one was also pretty popular. Whew. Okay. Moving into the competition of the 1980s. So now we actually have commercially available products, really, that you can use on a sort of bigger scale. You have things that are more applicative, useful. Processing is getting better. It's no longer like everything is horribly slow. So now things are starting to get competitive, especially, again, keep in mind, Apple and Microsoft were founded 5 years going into this decade. So setting up some rules, TCP IP, it's, Transfer Central Protocol, I want to say, an internet protocol. It's TCP IP. It's the basic rules for how information is carried across the internet. Commodore 64 is released. I want to talk about that first. Commodore 64 was, sorry about that. Commodore 64 was a pretty important computer. It was just very commercially successful. Again, we're growing on processing power, we're growing on this, on graphics, these sorts of things. It was, in terms of price, not horribly inaccessible. I know more about Commodore's later works, but Commodore 64 was definitely one of the things that put them on the map. And Commodore will continue to be very, very important, especially after they buy Amiga. We'll talk about what they do to Amiga, and how kind of the Amiga 1000 sort of started a separate computing culture. MIDI is released at this point. Now, when MIDI is released, not much happens. It's MIDI, by the way, is like this kind of digital interface integrated with music. I forgot what the acronym stands for, but if you can just look up MIDI. It's basically, you can experiment with piano on your computer, drums on your computer, guitar on your computer. You can actually make music on your computer. You can do musical things on your computer. And Atari ST, I believe, was the computer, or Amiga 1000, one of those two, was the one that really utilized MIDI and made it very popular. Yeah, it was Atari ST is the one that made it really, really popular with musicians. So many kind of more musically oriented, artistically oriented people took to the Atari ST. However, computing and electronics and that sort of whole field of work is generally not associated with those groups of people. So the Atari ST kind of failed because that was its biggest thing, and it got released at the worst time. It got released in 1985, same year as the Amiga 1000, which to this day still has fans, to give you context on how important the Amiga 1000 was. It was the first multimedia computer. It had revolutionary graphics. The bouncing ball demo, if you look that up, is one of the most famous things to ever come out of CES. It blew everyone's mind when they saw it, how good the bouncing ball demo works. There's actually some visual tricks that make it pretty low on processing power, but they use the Motorola 6800 CPU, which is this incredible CPU for the day. It just had unbelievable, it was years and years and years ahead of its time with, again, multimedia computer. That's a big deal. Killer games. That's one thing, is gaming and PCs are really integrated at this point. This is not some modern phenomenon where you have gaming and PC and they're in some way separate, in some way interconnected. This is always sort of a thing where people wanted to game on their computers. And Amiga 1000 really facilitated that because it had killer games. So yeah, and then we had the Macintosh coming out. Macintosh had really good color layout, like in terms of variety color. So did Amiga 1000. It was somewhat cheaper, certainly cheaper than some of Apple's later products. And it was aesthetically pleasing. Like everything about Apple, they've always done this. This is like part of the reason Apple's been so successful. And I believe in terms of their net worth is the #1 company in the world right now. They are very, very good at marketing. They're exceptional at marketing. They're exceptional at making their ads look good. If you watch a Microsoft ad, you'll fall asleep. If you'll watch a Google ad, you'll probably fall asleep. If you watch an Apple ad, you'll be interested from beginning to end. This has always been the case, and this really started with the Macintosh. If you notice, it came out in the year 1984. 1984, for those of you who are not into literature really, is a really famous book by a guy named George Orwell. It's a dystopian sci-fi novel. And they had I believe the 1984 movie came out in 1984. But I certainly know one thing that came out in 1984 was the 1984 Macintosh ad. They had this amazing ad. It had this like light source, and there was this kind of guy, he's from the future, and another guy in the commercial, he's like shocked that he's there. And then it pans into the white light, and you're trying to figure out what it's like, some futuristic technology or something. It's like this cool, amazingly shot commercial. It pans into this white light, and then within there, you see the Macintosh. This ad is one of the most famous ads of all time. It completely blew up the Macintosh. So you had this amazing computer years ahead of its time, the Amiga 1000. It's super fun, super practical for business users because it's multimedia, super fun for gamers because it's a gaming box as well. You have the Macintosh, which has this unbelievable reputation because of this exceptional world-class marketing. Atari ST kind of gets stuck in the middle because it's appealing to artists. So sorry I went on a little rant there. That's one of the more fun things to talk about. 1983 also, some stuff happens. So Apple releases Lisa. Lisa, named after Steve Jobs' daughter. Fascinating story about her. He like initially kind of disowned, wasn't really interested in her, but then later in life they made up. It's a really interesting story. He names the computer supposedly not after her, even though it's the name of his alleged daughter at this point. The main thing to take away from Lisa is not the story behind it, but it had a graphical user interface. So it had like, you could click on things, you have apps that you can click on. Big revolutionary stuff right here. It just had a generally like more graphical interface than other computers at this point. So Lisa was pretty semi-successful for that. It was not as popular as the Macintosh. Then you have Microsoft are also making some strides. Again, like I'm saying, they'll do much more stuff in the 90s. Apple will do actually even more stuff in the 2000s. Microsoft more so in the 90s. But you have version 1 of Word coming out, so they're already kind of starting to roll out the Microsoft 365 suite. Then you have the DNS, the domain name system, for how different things are named on the web, so like different naming and protocol, all that kind of stuff. All of that goes to the DNS. It's a growing system at this point. DNS is still in use to this day to figure out which things should be named what to make sure there aren't interferences. Fast forwarding to the end of the 1980s, you have Tim Berners-Lee inventing the World Wide Web. Again, this is not the same as the internet. The internet comes before the World Wide Web. Internet is a platform. It's as it was once called on some British show, I don't remember. It's a series of tubes. It's just a platform. World Wide Web is like an application on the platform of the internet. That's the general story there. Then in the 1980s, big time for gaming. All of these should look familiar. Certainly any Nintendo fan right now should just be like crying in happiness. Pac-Man comes out at the beginning of the decade. This is just one of the most famous games of all time, but in terms of technological revolution, not much. Donkey Kong, it introduces possibly the most famous video game character of all time, Jumpman, or as he's now known, Mario. Platforming game, kind of a new idea. Other than that, again, not too much new. The arcade graphics, higher resolution, but still very, very compressed graphics generally. Again, mostly limited to arcades. But also pretty common on, maybe not these specific games, but certainly other arcade games were basically transferred to the home with things like the Amiga 1000. And Tetris in 1984, this game super blew up. I was already talking about gaming being an international phenomenon with Space Invaders. Tetris took it a level further because it was invented by a mathematician from the what is now Russia, but in 1984, back then, it was the Soviet Union. This game was invented behind the Iron Curtain. It got sent out to some like American dev or something, and then it got published from there, which is incredible. So if you think about it, you have a communist dictatorship country, which then releases a video game. Effectively, this game was really effectively developed in the Soviet Union. So again, gaming really becomes an international phenomenon around this time, and then Nintendo kind of dominates at this point, right? Because Microsoft, there is no Xbox, no one cares at this point. Sony is not doing anything with PlayStation. Dominating things are arcades outside, PC consoles inside with like Amiga 1000. Mainly Amiga 1000, that was really the big one. So Nintendo was like, hey, what if we came up with consoles, video game consoles? So in 1985, you have the NES, some of the most iconic actually, no, that was more so on the Game Boy. So for the NES, you had, what'd you have? In the NES, you had just, it was their first console, right? So a lot of characters got their start from that. And same goes for the Game Boy. So the first Mario game was NES. The first Zelda game was also NES. They had feature ports, and by Zelda, Legend of Zelda, like the original Legend of Zelda, they come from these consoles. Game Boy's a little different, I'd say, from NES because you already had home consoles at this point. Game Boy was specifically meant to be portable. That was kind of the big thing. It was the first successful portable console, and Nintendo would definitely continue this trend with the DS, the 3DS, the 2DS, mainly the DSs, but there have been other portable consoles as well, and this was kind of like the first really successful one was the Game Boy. And I'd like to mention, by the way, going back to Amiga, that in terms of turning love of computing and computers into sort of a phenomenon, that was really started by the Amiga 1000. Again, there's still a loyal fan base to this day. There's a whole lore behind it. There's a lot of angst against Commodore for sort of running the company into the ground due to bad business practices. Just really, there's a whole culture around it. And then interesting computing really, really grew after Amiga 1000 and all of the love and hype around it. Now we're kind of getting into the Microsoft years. Modernization of tech in the 1990s. So Microsoft right now really asserts itself on the main stage, right? We have all these other players, right? Like Apple is doing their stuff with Apple II, Macintosh. Amiga has Amiga 1000, which is basically I can do anything and everything and more. Microsoft right now, they have their own box. They're working on their own operating systems, but they're not too important if you look at them in the long run. Like if you notice, the first thing I'm mentioning here about the OS is Microsoft 3.0 or Windows 3.0. I skipped their first three just because they weren't that important. MS-DOS, and I think there are actually multiple iterations of MS-DOS. So I'm skipping more than three. Windows 1.0, Windows 2.0, not really important. People actually started using Windows 3.0. Just in terms of popularity, I don't know the specifics behind like the different operating systems, what was more and less successful, all that kind of stuff. But Windows 3.0 was their first very successful operating system and really started to put them on the board. They got tons and tons of money, by the way, very, very quickly through their business practices, both by having unique, original, and innovative ideas, good marketing, just a lot of things Microsoft did right, effectively. They didn't really have like one golden goose that carried them throughout. Like with Apple, you could argue their one golden goose before iPhone, because that was easily, because you can put, there's two things that you can say Apple, like, because there's been some criticism of Apple for like stealing the mouse as an example, stolen from Xerox, right? That's not Steve Jobs or Steve Wozniak's innovation. There's two things you can give Apple credit for from a technical end. Undisputedly, it's the Macintosh as the box itself and the iPhone. With Microsoft, they weren't really established at this point like Apple already was, but with Windows 3.0 as a very successful operating system, yeah, now they're really putting themselves on the board. Commodore releases the CD-TV. I don't think there was much to this. It just wasn't a particularly successful box like many of theirs. It just didn't work too well. My understanding is it actually had some good specs, but they had poor business practices. They didn't manage their money well. They invested in a lot of risky stuff. And as you see a little bit later, only 3 years later, they declared bankruptcy. And because they had bought out Amiga, they dragged down Amiga with them. And this led to unbelievable scrutiny. There's actually in some of the versions of the Amiga 2000 and 500, which I might be talking about here, but in case I don't, I'll bring it up now. They had like these, Amiga 500 is a smaller version of the Amiga 1000. Amiga 2000 is a larger version of the Amiga 1000. You can see the hype around this computer if they release two separate versions of what are effectively the same computer. But in some of the versions of the Amiga 1000, I think it was, or maybe it was 2000, the developers of the Amiga, the actual members of Amiga, not the Commodore employees, wrote less than pleasant words. We'll put it that way. You can look this up yourself, but they specifically scorned. They actually engraved it in code in the. It's like if you access like certain parts, like the whatever deep subroots and files and all that sort of stuff of the box, you can find a message where they basically just roast all of Commodore for not being able to run a good business, because they could kind of smell that their business was going downhill, even though they had this exceptional world-class computer. Amiga, after being bought out by Commodore, they couldn't maintain it, and the developers were super duper mad at Commodore. It was tons and tons of angst, and again, there's an entire fascinating story when it comes to the Amiga and Commodore. 1993, MP3 files. Now we're talking about transferring audio in what is like a mainstream way, and without using like tons and tons of storage. Like MP3s are pretty space efficient. They have like better stuff now, but for the time, MP3s were sort of a big deal. And now they're like the standard, right? If you want to have an audio file, use MP3. Like with video, there's multiple, but really for audio, like MP3 is a big one. 1995, Windows 95 comes out. Again, another super successful OS from Windows or from Microsoft. They generally, like when it comes to actual computers, they don't really have many super successful computers in terms of the computers themselves, but they have a lot of good operating systems, OSs. We'll talk about more later. Again, I don't know the specs of each of them, but they will keep each successive OS they come out with, not each one, but like a lot of the ones they come out with are hyper famous and very, very popularized. Like there are more Windows 10s and 7s out there. I guarantee you there are more 10s and 7s out there than basically any other OS, right? You have Mac OS, Chrome OS. These are not as used as Windows 10. Windows 10 being, well, Windows 10 was the current one. They just recently came out with Windows 11. We'll see how that was. Email is also making its way onto the scene at this point. Hotmail was launched. This was very, very popular, especially in the 2000s, where you have the whole "You Got Mail" movie. Big deal with that. So you have now like publicly available like email being shared, all that sort of stuff. Gmail will come pretty soon. It'll blow up even more. Yeah, so that's a big deal with Hotmail. Hotmail, I believe, was bought by Microsoft. Microsoft bought out many, many companies over time. Then we have Deep Blue. So now we're getting into the artificial intelligence. Deep Blue was one of the earlier AIs at this point. As you can see, it's 1997. And it beat Garry Kasparov in chess. Garry Kasparov was the Russian world champion at chess. And a computer beat it in 5 out of 6 games in a tournament, or like an exhibition match. So there's definitely been some alarmism about the efficacy of an artificial intelligence, but even now, 25 years later, artificial intelligence has a long way to go until it gets like really scary. Like the scariest thing artificial intelligence can do at this point is it will give you an oddly specific TikTok that's related to something you recently looked up. Other than that, like what can artificial intelligence do? How many times have you interact with a chat bot that's like pretty stupid, even though they'll call them like these intelligent bots? With that said, though, there's still some definitely impressive things that they can do. And again, this goes all the way back to the 90s. And then you have some early innovations in quantum computing in 1998, but even to this day, that technology is still highly suspect. If they can get really good quantum computers, we won't need the computers that we're using right now. They literally run thousands and thousands of times faster and more efficiently than current computers. They don't use binary systems, which is everything is binary computing as of now. As you can see, my neighbor's dog agrees. So 1990s, there's some growing pains. This is really where console wars start, like in the traditional sense as we know them today. So you have Nintendo versus PlayStation versus Xbox versus PCs. This is really where it starts. So again, PCs have been gaming boxes going back to the 80s, and now that's kind of picking up steam again with Steam, ironically enough. But in the 90s, you have some like pretty key games that are really like, now we're getting into the 3D territory as a commonality, like with Sonic games, right? You have Sonic Adventure and all that sort of stuff. Exceptional game, by the way. So you have Wolfenstein 3D, Sega releasing Sonic. Again, we're moving into 3D, higher class stories, higher class graphics, higher class gameplay, more buttons on the consoles. We're going bigger, we're going better. We're getting more and more. And we've kind of been doing this with our games. We're kind of reaching a limit. How much better can our graphics get? They're already hyper realistic. But 90s, this is where we are really going for the make it as good and real as possible sort of trend. That's where really this kind of started. It was in the 1990s. Doom comes out, hyper popular FPS or TPS. I think you can change it, but I'm pretty sure Doom is an FPS. And then Mortal Kombat. Games are also becoming edgier now. They're trying to become more realistic, more violent, right? Like a famous example of this is the Counter-Strike gaming series. It's really, it's not horribly violent and bloody, although depending on which standard you use, I guess you could say, but it's certainly very violent and it's very realistic. Mortal Kombat is definitely overly violent, though. There's like very brutal kill scenes and all that sort of stuff in Mortal Kombat. So there's always been controversy around that. Now we have the emergence of PlayStation in 1994, Sony coming out with it. Success immediately. PlayStation, any console PlayStation comes out with will be a success. Mostly because they don't like hyper sell things like Nintendo does, and Microsoft, by the way, with Xbox. Like they always have like, this is the version 1, this is the version 1S, and this is the version 1X. It's not really a big deal when more so with Microsoft, it's not as big of a deal anymore when the new Xbox come out. Same with Nintendo, not as big, but PlayStation, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a few sub consoles in there, but mostly like their main series hitters have been successes all the way through. So PlayStation 1, definite competition for Nintendo home gaming console specifically for gaming. And again, and Sony, big company. Tomb Raider. So now we're getting in, again, games are controversial at this point. Like the portrayal of like women in gaming, as an example, has been a controversial issue since the 90s. It started with Tomb Raider. It goes even today with like GTA. This has been controversy as games become more and more realistic. There's like, what kind of stuff do we want to be depicting, even in this sort of whimsical context, I suppose. It's always been a controversy, and there will still continue to be controversy in gaming, probably for a long time. Like as things get more and more realistic, how deep and dark will we go? How deep and dark will we let the people go? It's sort of been an issue that kind of really arose at this point. And then in 1998, I had to highlight this because it's my favorite game, but also there's a reason for this. The Ocarina of Time is released. This game effectively is a movie. it has exceptional gameplay. I'm not saying it's like low on gameplay, but the combination of story, because oftentimes in games you'll have like a story that is secondary to games at this point. It's not really a key component. It's more like, here's the gameplay and here's the graphics and here's like some story to go along with it to facilitate the events. Ocarina of Time and other games of this era, right? Like Nintendo games, you have like the GoldenEye games, all that kind of stuff coming out like for N64. These things were very story oriented. They're making their games more like movies. The games are becoming better and better and closer to real life. So these last three all kind of follow the same trend in gaming. Now we're moving on to the 2000s. How are we doing time? We have 19 minutes. Okay. Sorry, the Q&A is going to be a bit short. So in 2000, Agile becomes kind of a main style of coding via the Agile manifesto. Agile, for those of you who don't know, it's a great method of coding. It's basically just like, not tips on how to coding. It's a method of coding. It's a very structured method of like what's the most optimal way to program. What are like the better ways you can program? Like one of the most famous things that came out of Agile is you should always program in bits and pieces, always. Even if you don't want, like even if you think it's stupid, like if you're doing like a basic for loop in Java, right? If you're comfortable in Java, and you put a single print in there just to make sure it's printing properly, you might look at that as a waste of time. But since mistakes are really, really easy to make, it's recommended that you will test even the most basic things on the smallest level. So stuff like that is part of like the Agile method of programming. Apple is also trying to do their own stuff with OSs, right? They're releasing the Mac OS at this point. Microsoft and Apple definitely kind of isolationists, right? Like Apple wants you to use nothing but Apple products. Microsoft wants to use nothing but Microsoft products. So they all kind of have equivalent branches of like their own separate fields. 2004, excuse me, 2004 Firefox comes out, browser. Firefox went through all kinds of growing pains. You had Netscape, there was a whole thing there. Microsoft bought them. Then they got bought out by Mozilla. Then you had Mozilla. They made Mozilla Firefox, and then Firefox is just now its own thing. But that's definitely been one of the more famous and used browsers over time. Then you have Apple releasing the MacBook Pro. Again, they're trying to kind of return to the way they once were in computing. It's not super big deal. I just want to bring up MacBook Pro because MacBooks are still pretty relevant today. What I care much more about is the iPhone. This is 2007, right? This isn't even like a 50-year change, right? Like PCs really came about with the Commodore PET as part of the 1977 Trinity. So PCs really became like home PCs became a big deal in the 1980s. Really, is like kind of the predominant time when people got computers in their homes. If you let's say you use 1980 as the starting point, just like as an arbitrary thing, it's easy math. 40 years. That's a pretty decent amount of time. These became popularized in well under 10. Everyone has one of these days. Tell me, there's like 5 people I know my age who don't have a phone. I don't even know if it's 5 people. Everyone has a phone. And there's this very iconic presentation by Steve Jobs. The iPhone has been a massive success ever since it came out the door. And Apple basically just keeps reselling iPhones. They keep like coming out with a new iPhone every single year. The subsequent iPhones, I'm sure this will make some people mad. The subsequent iPhones really didn't innovate as much. But the initial iPhone was completely groundbreaking and easily the biggest, at least in my opinion, the biggest development in the 2000s by far was the release of the iPhone. Because now we have computing power in the palm of our hand that we can bring outside with us and use at any given point. Another big OS for Windows, Windows Vista. I'm kind of giving you guys like the general, I'm giving you just a Windows timeline really, like the Microsoft OS. So if you want to sound smart to your friends, tell them, what were the more successful Windows OSs. It goes 3.0, 3.1, because 3.0 was super bugged out when it came out, 95, Vista, 7, 10, and we'll see about 11. Again, MS-DOS, not a big deal, just famous because it's their first one. Chrome comes out, Firefox was kind of dominating at this point because people didn't like Internet Explorer. I think Internet Explorer was already out at this point, but it's never been the best browser. It'll never be. Well, now they have Edge. That'll also never be the best browser. Everyone basically just uses, in my opinion, I think a lot of people's opinion, you typically will either use Chrome or Firefox, and those have been pretty dominating since they came out. And then in 2009, Bitcoin and Windows 7 launched. Again, another hyper successful Windows OS here, Windows 7. Many computers still run on Windows 7. I think my work computer runs on Windows 7. Probably if you have any like older PC, yours runs on Windows 7 or Windows 8. Bitcoin I only mentioned because it's very relevant now, but this is kind of a trend like over the last couple of years, really, like the Bitcoin and these. Now we have like these other cryptocurrencies, right? We have Ethereum, we have Cardano, those are both really promising. You have Dogecoin, right? Elon's favorite. I mean, supposedly Elon's favorite. I'm just mentioning it here because it came out and it's much more important in this like kind of like end of 2010s, beginning of 2020s. But yeah, not much there. Yeah, I need to speed this along. So for 2000s in gaming, the PS2 comes out in 2000, another hyper popular console. I think more successful than the PS1. Yeah, tons of iconic games coming from the PS2. You have the GameCube coming out in 2001, possibly Nintendo's all-time best console. Super complicated. They had to return to simplicity with the Wii that I'm going to go into here in just a moment. But the GameCube was very, very complicated. The games on it, you had Super Smash Bros. Melee, which is still popular and played to this day and revered for technical ability. Same can be said of Super Mario Sunshine. Those are kind of the two big ones I can think of. I want to say, no, Ocarina of Time was an N64 game. Yeah, it was an N64 game. But GameCube was like hard. GameCube was hard to play. Revolutionary for its time, the level of gaming, the games that came out of this thing, absolutely iconic. But yeah, GameCube was an amazing console, an amazing box. I'm obviously speaking with bias here, as you can see. I love the GameCube games. But it's very technical and not particularly innovative, I'd say. I'd say they made the games, obviously they're better looking than their N64 counterparts. The graphics were more realistic. 60 FPS games, by the way, which is not something other consoles could say at this point. At least not other Nintendo consoles. N64 was not a 60 FPS box. PS2 might have been. And the Xbox 360, this is where Xbox really blows up, right? You have Microsoft acquiring Xbox, doing the whole Xbox 360 shtick. Super famous, you have the Kinect coming out a few years later. Kinect, we'll talk about in a moment. It's not really, it's a failed experiment more than anything else. PS3 I'd bring up, again, just another hyper successful console. PlayStation, just again, holding consistently very good consoles. You'll always have the PlayStation fans. They'll be very adamant about their console. It looks like great consoles. PlayStation 4, certainly from what I've used, is a great console. PlayStation all around great, always keeping consistency in the market. And then the Wii came out, and the Wii completely changed everything because we were used to, at this point, you have PC games, lean in, the gamer stance, you're leaning in on your monitor, CSGO, 5 seconds left in the game, changing guns, scoping, all that kind of stuff. You have your Super Smash Bros. Melee, you're getting arthritis, you're all scrunched up playing video games in the colloquial way. Everything was buttons and switches and levers and this and this and this. We completely changed all that. It revolutionized gaming temporarily because you have simpler games. They're simple. The Wii games are much simpler, right? Sure, you had pro controllers in this, but these are kinds of like additions, bastardizations for people who wanted them, who wanted to like play the games competitively. It was meant to be a family-friendly console. Again, games were getting more, not robust, but I guess more mature at this point, right? You have games like around this time period, just a couple of years later, you have BioShock coming out. That's an unbelievably dark and gritty game. You have GTA. I'm not allowed to talk about on the stream, all the stuff that happens in GTA. There's all these controversies. You have Mortal Kombat. Wii is a return to kid-friendly games that you can play with your family. So that's one thing that's just absolutely crazy about the Wii. And Microsoft try to get in on this with the Kinect, and it didn't work quite as well. Even though the Kinect, honestly, in my opinion, was a really cool thing, it just objectively was not as much of a success because they went on to drop it in future iterations of the Xbox. Lastly, the 2010s. So Apple releases the iPad and iPhone 4. Again, as you can see, it's only 3 years later. They're already on their 4th iPhone. I just said this to make a point. iPhone is huge, and it deserves to be huge because it's completely revolutionary technology and super hyper duper unbelievably important in this modern context. In 2012, the first Raspberry Pi was released, and it specifically appealed to kids. You could now build a PC yourself. You, 11-year-old child, could build a PC. That is a big deal. It was this sort of attempt that's now become mainstream to get kids and younger people interested in CS. I mean, shoot, look at me. I'm 16 years old talking about computer science, which is I haven't even gone into that field yet as a profession. And many of the listeners here will probably be 18 or well under 18 or just a little bit over. It's not people who are well established in the CS field yet. It's just people who are interested. So this kind of movement of like trying to get kids into CS specifically, not even gaming, CS as a whole, really kind of got popularized here, starting with Raspberry Pi. I specifically want to bring up iPhone 5S in 2013 because it's the first smartphone with a 64-bit processor. And just the amount of like bits, all at 64, all the like the different bit processors, all it means is like how many bits it processes given like a certain very, very minute time period. For context, that's similar to computers. Some computers have 128, I think, bit processors. Some have 64. So just to give you context of like how big and powerful the computing power on phones is. Then in 2014, the first 8 terabyte hard drive was released by Seagate. Keep in mind, you needed entire rooms. You need entire rooms for megabytes before. Now megabytes are single pictures, and you have 8 terabyte hard drives. I have a 512 gigabyte hard drive. I have a 512 gigabyte hard drive that I've stored like all kinds of stuff on. It's crazy. You can load this stuff into your laptop, for crying out loud. Data and storage have become exponentially more, I guess, whatever. They can hold much more data at like an exponential rate than they were able to before. The multiples of 2 by which they're going are just insane. This was 2014. In 2021, as of February, Seagate came out with an 18 terabyte hard drive. They've already over doubled it in just under 10 years. Windows 10, Windows' most recent hyper successful OS, comes out in 2015, and Google declares quantum supremacy. They think we're the farthest ahead with quantum computing. We're going far in and hard on with the quantum supremacy. So quantum supremacy basically just means like we have the best quantum technology. That's all it means. So yeah, Google all the way through. And finally, for games in the 2010s, there's this sort of revolution now where gaming is kind of spreading into every possible field you can think of. So for one thing, indie games at the beginning of the decade get big popularity. They have like 2 waves of popularity, which we'll talk about. First wave is just with the release of Minecraft. Minecraft is a global phenomenon by itself. There's no other way to describe it. I believe it's the most sold and bought game of all time right now. Like of all time, like more than Tetris, more than Pac-Man, more than Donkey Kong, more than everything in the span of about 10 years, to give you context on Minecraft. And it's not a free game, because the free game thing is just something that came up in the last 5 years. Minecraft is a global phenomenon. It's made by indie developers before Mojang got bought by like some big company. I think they're like doing stuff with Microsoft. Minecraft's a global phenomenon, and it gets real interest going in the indie field. There's a slight deviation from this with Skylanders. Skylanders was another like big phenomenon, not on the level of Minecraft, but the idea of augmented reality gameplay was huge, especially with this new motion-based, kid-friendly technology that the Wii brought in and kind of brought back in a sense, because they had some motion technology going before that was just not really all as successful. In 2012, Nintendo shoots themselves in the foot with the Wii U. Commercial failure. Nintendo, after console after console after console, winning, just to varying extents. Wii U, which I think was a great console. I love the Wii U. It's a great box, in my opinion. Commercial failure, though, objectively. They did not innovate. They had some good games on there, but they didn't innovate. They focused. They were so unbelievably successful with the Wii. They dominated the gaming market with the Wii that they were just like, let's just make another Wii. But people were like, no, we want something new. So Nintendo really kind of left the sphere as like the main gaming voice, or not voice, but the main gaming entity for like a while with the Wii U. And then the Oculus Rift got interest going specifically in virtual reality. We had augmented reality gaming, now we have virtual reality gaming, and both of these are still very prominent entities, especially virtual reality gaming. There's tons and tons of hype around virtual reality gaming now. 2013, Sony releases the PS4. I don't know why I keep mentioning this without going into specifics. It's another very successful PlayStation. They're keeping themselves well established. Xbox has their like the Xbox Ones at this point. Those are prominent. Again, PlayStation, Sony, they're sticking to their formulas. They keep moving forward, better graphics, better games, blah blah blah. And Nintendo really isn't. So they kind of leave the in this middle of 2010 territory. Nintendo falls into like a third place, like a distant third place. The free-to-play model gets promoted in 2014 with some games. This is mainly promulgated though later on with Fortnite. And then Epic Games, right? This sort of like you're free to play this game to a large extent, but then you should buy it. You should buy certain aspects of the game. That is a very popular business model these days. Again, Epic Games capitalizing on this hugely, and a lot of games are doing this. They're lowering the price of games, but in-game purchases are just like through the roof. The most egregious example of this is Battlefront 2, a game that costs $60. It's a AAA game by EA, and I believe has like somewhere in the range of $3,000 worth if you want to play the entire game of like in-game purchases. Amazon acquires Twitch, helps them grow. Twitch, super prominent, can make AAA. It makes AAA games way bigger because it's like a convenient method of sharing that, and it makes indie games bigger. And Minecraft and those kind of similar indie games, Among Us, Papers, Please, I remember was a big one at one point. I think Last of Us, all indie games, all hyper popularity. Of course, Fall Guys was a big deal for a little while pretty recently. All hyper popularity largely because of Twitch. The biggest example of a game blowing up into oblivion because of Twitch is League of Legends. League of Legends has an unbelievable Twitch community. And lastly, for augmented reality, just kind of one more big point, is Pokemon Go. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Here are my citations. As you can tell, it's a pretty lucrative project. We have 5 minutes for Q&A. Emma, let's go quickly. I'm really sorry about taking that much time.
It's all good. Thank you again, Ben, for presenting this. I think I know I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else did too, and had a good time listening to your presentation. So now let's open up questions. Let's see if anyone has any questions. But I thought your presentation was really thorough and well done.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone at home thought so. If you're not able to get questions, I'm on the Hack Table Discord for anyone here on Discord. If you have a question, put it in general at some people, at me if you have my Discord. My Discord's long, so I'm not going to repeat it on here. But just type a question in general on Hack Table, and I can DM you if you have any specific questions, if I can answer it. Like I said, I talk a decent amount about hardware here, even though it's not my expertise. I bring up PlayStation 5 times, even though PlayStation not my expertise. I'm a Nintendo guy. But if you do have a question, anyone, I'll see what I can do. And speaking of, Emma, in these last several minutes, any questions you have on available for me right now?
I have a question for myself. So what would you say is your favorite game?
Ocarina of Time. It's from an overall perspective. In terms of story, my favorite is easily BioShock. In my opinion, you can watch the gameplay isn't even that great, but you can watch a playthrough of BioShock and get the same value out of it. It's effectively a movie, and it's much better than most movies, in my opinion. It has one of the best plot twists in the history of anything ever. Better than the Sixth Sense plot twist, in my opinion. BioShock, amazing story-based game. In terms of gameplay, hard to say just because there's so many, but overall, I'd say Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, from a combination of gameplay, story, graphics, music. The music is still iconic. Gerudo Valley is one of the most famous songs of video game songs of all time. Song of Storms, Song of Time. Yeah, those are the big ones that come to mind. But it's just overall an exceptional game. Best Mario game though has to be Mario Odyssey. Even better than Mario Galaxy. I don't know. That might hurt some people. I grew up with Mario Galaxy, and I'm saying that. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again for presenting, and for all the Hack Table participants who are viewing. We hope that you check out the other workshops and presentations coming up in the next day or so. And good luck with your project and just the event in general. So, thank you.
Good luck, everyone. I'm sure your project is great, just not as good as mine. Talk to you later.